Well, I've been amazed in making the transition out of the military and into working in public policy, just how much ignorance there is of normal military issues, which is pretty staggering in a country like Australia where our national day is Anzac Day. It's all about the military. And I was really struck by that paradox. Why is it that we know so much about the military of 100 years ago and we know so little about the military of today? And how do you explain that? So that's what started me thinking about this book and writing this book. There are a couple of different types of books about Anzac and Gallipoli. I mean, there are hundreds of books about Anzac and Gallipoli. Most of them will try and take some aspect of the war in 1914 to 18 and give it a new light. But more recently, we've started to see a few authors writing, saying, what is this all about? Why is this such a big deal? In 2010, there was a very controversial book by Henry Reynolds and Marilyn Lake, What's Wrong with Anzac? Which really quite seriously attacked Anzac as a myth for white Anglo-Saxon males. I think it overlooked a lot of the good things about Anzac. I mean, there is a lot to like in Anzac. There are a lot of virtues, and the idea of being part of something bigger than an individual, I think, is important too. But the biggest problem with that book is that it made the assumption that more Anzac equals more militarism, and I don't think that rang true. What I'm doing is looking at the topic through the eyes of someone who's been in the military and trying to examine Anzac on its own grounds, not as a historical narrative, but as what it claims to be, which is looking after soldiers and making sure we never make military mistakes again. Well, there's a number of costs. The first one is the financial cost. The money we're spending on Anzac is extraordinary. Australia is a country in which there are already thousands of war memorials in every single little town, where every school child grows up understanding what the Anzacs did, understanding where Gallipoli is and how it fits into our national history, and where most adults would have been to a dawn service and seen an Anzac Day parade. But on top of that, we're going to spend more than $300 million over the next 4 years retelling those stories, re-raising awareness of Anzac and Gallipoli, which is an extraordinary amount, particularly from governments who are scrabbling around for funding for a lot of different policy issues, and particularly at a time when the budget of the Defence Force is being cut. But there's also deeper costs. I think one of the points I make in the book is that there are deep costs to the military itself. It's internalised some of the problems with the Anzac myth, and it's had some negative consequences for the way the military goes about its business. For soldiers as well, there are some consequences of the national obsession with Anzac. Some of them feel a little bit ashamed that they don't live up to the legend and that they don't plug into the way Australians conceive of war. And for the nation itself, I think in spending so much time looking backwards at our military history, we neglect and we crowd out thinking about current military problems and the horrible possibility that we might need to go to war again. Well, we've created these amazing sacrificial rites around soldiers who die in battle, and we take it very, very seriously. When a number of soldiers died in 2012, we had 5 soldiers die in a single day. The Prime Minister was in the Cook Islands, the Defence Minister was in Vietnam, the Chief of the Defence Force was in Indonesia. They all came home straight away. The Prime Minister was due to meet with Hillary Clinton, cancelled that meeting. That's how seriously we take the death of soldiers. I think that's because so much of the Anzac legend and the Anzac service is about funerals and remembering the dead. And that's what war memorials are about too, and we're still spending millions of dollars building new war memorials. But then at the same time, we've neglected so much of what's happening with current serving living soldiers, particularly those coming back from Afghanistan. And in some cases you can see a direct trade-off. In one state government, I won't mention which one, they were talking about spending tens of millions of dollars on effectively a new memorial to dead soldiers and talking about spending tens of thousands of dollars for the veterans coming back into their community. So there's a huge disparity there, and I think we need to spend more time remembering the living. Look, Look, it's not just about funding for returned soldiers. Obviously, there's a lot you can do to make the transition for returned soldiers much more seamless. Funding for mental health initiatives, funding for social initiatives. But a lot of it is just about attention. Psychologists, military psychologists will tell you that one of the most important determinants of whether soldiers go on to have post-traumatic stress disorder is not the original event that they see or that they experience. It's the homecoming experience. And we saw this with the Vietnam vets. If you get the homecoming experience wrong, it can be tremendously traumatic. And we're going to have a homecoming experience over the next 4 years where we're not going to pay much attention to people coming back from Afghanistan at all. We're not going to understand what they did, and we're not going to be able to tell them that we value what they did either in a meaningful way. And most of the soldiers I speak to coming back from Afghanistan want that understanding. And I think that's the real cost of all this, that we've just crowded out the space of the guys and girls that we're sending overseas to fight for us right now. One of the chapters in the book looks at organisations set up for returned soldiers in Australia and the way we have charities for the military and for veterans. And I think on the surface of it, you would look at Australia and think that we're doing pretty well there. We have hundreds of RSLs around the country with pokies, with bars, raising billions of dollars of revenue. And you would expect when you hear the last post played and you see military memorabilia on the walls that those kind of organisations are taking care of veterans. But over the last decade, I think we've seen a military charity sector that has been remarkably inefficient and in some cases incredibly ineffective. And because it's covered in ANZAC, because it hosts the Dawn service every year, it's been very hard to critically assess that. Now we're starting to see a couple of different things. We're starting to see some big tensions in the RSL, particularly in its relationship with some of these clubs. Some of these RSL clubs now are enormous. Rooty Hill RSL calls itself the Las Vegas of the West. It's so big it wants its own postcode. It donates a minuscule amount to military charities. It does so little to look after veterans when you compare how much revenue it's actually making. But equally, there are other parts of the organisation that are doing good work, and there are new charities that are coming through as well. There are charities that aren't just about getting together and having a beer, and that are much more vibrant and much more accessible. In the book, I talk about the charity Soldier On, which is run by a friend of mine, which has been remarkably successful in getting younger soldiers together, particularly looking after wounded soldiers, and getting them out into the community, linking up with sports teams. They have an organisation here in Melbourne that works with St Kilda Football Club, which gets wounded veterans in to talk to them at halftime, which gets them out there at football games, gets them interacting with the community, and that's been tremendously powerful. And so we're starting to see a degree of innovation, but it's come very late. And one of the reasons it's come very late is because no one was looking at this sector and saying, what's going on here? Are we doing enough? Are we innovating? Are these charities actually getting out ahead of government and working faster than government? I've had an amazing time in the Australian military. I joined back in 2002. I was lucky enough to, in a short time, a career of 8 years, see a lot of the different operations we were doing in Baghdad, in southern Iraq, in the Solomon Islands, and in Afghanistan. Worked with some extraordinary people, was led by and led some extraordinary people as well. The Australian Defence Force is an amazing institution. It's right on the tip of international affairs. We ask it to do a lot, and we ask some very young people to shoulder some seriously great responsibility. It really taught me a lot, and it was a fascinating experience, but it was also something that I felt was very detached from my everyday life. The people I went to university with thought it was an odd decision to join the military. People in my hometown of Sydney thought it was quite strange to meet someone who'd been in the military and would get some very bizarre questions. I was a cavalry officer when I first joined the army, and I would constantly be getting asked whether I rode horses and why we still had horses. And after a while, I just started telling people I had a fake job, which I think is what a lot of Army people do. People will tell you they're firefighters, or they'll come up with some sort of silly job title. But it's an amazing thing to do, but it's not a very well understood thing to do either.